Well, hi everybody. My name is Larry Sigel with Iowa School Finance Information Services, and I'm here to talk a little bit about the Fairfield Community School District's finances tonight. And we're going to break this up into three sections. One is we're going to talk a little bit about just some background on school finance so that everybody's on the same page. And then we're going to look where your district is at currently, and then kind of the most intriguing part, I guess, or the most important part is going to be looking into the future. And we've got a projection model that we use, and we'll look big picture at some of those issues that are facing the school district, and look at some scenarios. So, without further ado, I'll just get rolling right into it. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and um, this is, I know that after I'm done with this, probably won't believe me, but this is actually part of a larger presentation on Iowa School Finance, and just a little bit about who I am and who we are. We're a for-profit consulting company located in the Des Moines area. My background is I spent the first 10 years of my working career working for the legislature. I was a tax analyst for the Legislative Fiscal Bureau. I then went to the School Board Association for a decade, and then I founded ISFIS in 2009. My partner, Margaret Buckton, is a lobbyist, and her expertise is both communications and legislative. And we both share a passion for hopefully elevating what school districts do by really providing better data and allowing schools to make better decision making. We're going to talk real briefly about just powers and authorities, funds and revenues, this concept of spending authority, because it's really important in understanding a school district's financial health. We'll talk about some other funds and financial health. One of the things I think that's really difficult or really counterintuitive is this fact that school districts have restricted funding sources, and we can't just use any dollar we have for any purpose that the district decides. And that comes out of state and federal law. Even within our school district's general fund, which I realize sounds general, but there are even restrictions within the school district's general fund. Those restrictions can come out of administrative rules by the Department of Education. This chart, while admittedly complex, hopefully tries to distill down, some of those questions of where's the money come from, what fund does it go to, and what can we spend it on. And tonight we're going to spend most of our time talking about the school district's general fund. But and if you follow the squiggly lines, you're going to see that that's made up of state aid, property taxes, and some federal funds. And those are going to be real critical when we talk about what's happening with school districts, with Fairfield especially. And then we're going to talk about some staff salary, about the things that come out of, for example, the general fund, salaries and benefits, which are the primary expenditure that come out of there. So when we think about a school district's general fund, it's to get in your mind's eye the picture of a single child, and that budget is student driven. And so I always like to say each bright smiling face that comes into your district brings with them about $7,500, and each bright smiling face that leaves your district takes with them about $7,500. Second one is that schools are budget limited, not property tax rate limited. So if tomorrow we magically doubled the property value in the school district, it'd be a wonderful thing because the property tax rate would fall, but the district wouldn't have any more money to spend in the general fund. The third one is that the tax rate is driven more by the formula. And when I talk about the formula, I'm talking about the state funding formula, than by district actions. Now, I don't want to say that school districts don't have an impact on their property taxes. They do, but some of it's driven by formula. And then that last one is the one we already talked about, that school districts can only spend funds on allowable purposes. And just to give you a feel statewide for where the money comes from for schools, in a school district's general fund, statewide, only about 34% is local property taxes, about 56% is state aid, and in this case, about 8%, excuse me, about 7.8% is federal funds. And this was actually, it was a pandemic year, so that federal fund number is a little larger than it would normally be. I want to talk about spending authority because it's a really important concept in understanding what impacts schools. Ultimately, the state controls the max amount that school districts can legally spend. And you might ask yourself, why do they care? Um, Really, it's to enforce equity. And the basic principle under the formula is that every student should be worth about the same no matter where they live. And to keep property rich areas from just levying and spending more, there's this limitation on school districts' spending authority. Now, it's important to note that this only applies to a school district's general fund. Every other fund operates exactly the way you think it would. If you've got a buck, you could spend it. But school districts by law are required to keep two sets of books. They're required to keep their normal accounting set of books. That wouldn't matter whether you're a not-for-profit, a for-profit, or governmental entity. Sometimes we call these or fund balance or cash set of books. We're also required to keep track of the spending authority set of books as well. And the analogy I'm going to use tonight is when a child shows up on your doorstep, they hand you a credit card, and on that credit card it says the Fairfield Community School District may expend about $7,600 on this child's behalf. So the reason I use this analogy is because it's not cash, and it is distinct from that. Where's the spending authority come from? Well, we talked about it a little bit already, right? Is how many kids you have, and then that credit card limit per child is now that the enrollment count that we use is always a year behind. We always use a prior year enrollment count. So this October, this last October's count will be utilized for the next fiscal year. That credit card limit per child, that cost per child, is set by the legislature when they set the state supplementary assistance rate, or the SSA rate. And you're going to hear a lot of discussion about that early in session because it's one of the things that impacts schools probably more than anything. Ultimately, that spending authority is then funded by a combination of state aid and property taxes. So ultimately, the legal limit on a school district's spending is not how much cash they have in the bank, it's their spending authority for a year. And that total spending authority is just that current year spending authority, right? The collection of those credit cards from all those kids, plus any previous year's unused spending authority. Why are we talking about all of this spending authority stuff? Because ultimately it's illegal for a school district to exceed its spending authority. If you'd ever heard of either Russell or Farragut school districts, you won't anymore, and it's because they were closed because they were deemed to be not financially viable. The single measure that the state uses to determine whether a school district is financially viable or not is do they have positive unspent budget authority? Are they positive at the end of the fiscal year? And if they're not, they can be subject to significant sanctions. And so it's the one thing that we use as kind of a bellwether measure of a school district's financial health. So when we're talking about the general fund, that's really what we're focusing on, is kind of that end measure, or that way we determine how we're doing financially. I'm not going to talk about, we've got the rest of the PowerPoint presentation I know that you guys have. That talks about funds that are also outside of the general fund, and we're not going to spend a lot of time. We're not going to spend any time on those tonight, other than just to talk about them as part of your overall property tax rate. But I wanted to give you a little bit of just basic school finance, because it's really important to know when we start talking about your financial health, what you need to be looking for. So I'm going to pause here for a second, stop my screen share, and just see if there are any questions up to this point.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
I didn't really have a question. I more just forgot that I was supposed to tell people that there are some handouts in the back. They kind of lay out our, our projections and kind of our numbers. Go ahead and grab one. It's some really good info. Also, some note cards are around, so if you want to have any questions, you can write them down, throw them in the box up here, and we'll try to get some answers.
Okay. I was going to go into one of the handouts that I had provided, and this is a one-page, excuse me, fact sheet that we use with school districts all around the state. And on that, it lists a number of key financial trends. We're just going to go around the horn and work my way around this sheet. So I'll zoom in on the individual sections that I'm talking about, and we'll just talk about what they mean and why they're important. Um, we're going to start in the upper left-hand corner, and we're going to start with this section, which is just the current year property tax rates. And I'm going to zoom in. I don't want to make anybody seasick this way, but just talk about the individual property tax rates. Now, all of these property tax rates have a ranking that's associated with them, and everything in here is ranked with 1 being the highest and 325 being the lowest. There are 325 school districts in the state in the current fiscal year of fiscal year 2024. And so, for example, if we look at the second entry here, your additional property tax levy rate at $2, almost $2.40 per thousand, ranks 209th highest. So just so you can see how these are all work. Now, the first one, we didn't talk about this specifically, but the first one, if you look at the 540 uniform levy, the uniform levy rate, the reason your district is ranked 1 is because you're tied with every district, because every district has a $5.40 uniform levy. It lists the other levies that are within the general fund. So, for example, the cash reserve levy, also the instructional support levy. All of those levies then sum up to make your total general fund levy of $9.14. Now, there are other levies outside of the general fund. For example, your management levy, which funds things like property and casualty insurance, workers' compensation, early retirement. It's not a rate limited levy. It's limited only by the fact that the purpose is so narrow that you can't use it for anything else. Your voted pebble or physical plant and equipment levy at 67 cents per thousand. There are that's a maximum, could go up as high as $1.34. Your district has about half of the levy that's available to it. District also has a 33-cent voted pebble. These are both ways that we fix and buildings and buy buses and equipment and those kind of things. The district does not have a PEARL or a debt service levy. So the total non-general fund levies are $1.44. For in the current fiscal year, a total property tax rate of $10.59 per thousand, which ranks 276th out of 325 districts. So little in the bottom quarter, below the bottom quarter of districts. So I know nobody likes to hear this, but a relatively low property tax rate, being 276. The middle would be, half of 325. The district uses an income surtax to offset some of the impact of the property taxes that are associated with the instructional support levy. And there's a 1% income surtax, which offsets about 17 cents per thousand of what would be property tax. Income surtax doesn't give any more money to spend. It just lightens the load on property tax. Down here, we've got just a couple of charts on enrollment. One is the budget, what we call budget enrollment. Those are resident students prior to open enrollment impact. And these are resident students. Here is the open enrollment impact. The red being the out, the blue being the in, and the green being the net. History is of the property tax rate. And so the property tax rate at one time was as high as around 1548 per thousand. It's come down quite a bit. Some of that's due to not being able to levy much cash reserve right now, but and some other issues in paying off a bond issue, I believe, as well. Your district solvency ratio, which is just a measure of their fund balance at the end of the year, you can see it has been between 15 and 25%, which is considered a good solvency ratio. And one thing that we tracked here was we talked about was the unspent authorized budget, and you can see the history going back a long, long way over 22 years. And you can see that this increase over the last 3 fiscal years, you'll notice especially, and we're going to talk about that now. This is only through FY 2022, so that's a year old. We don't have at the state level, they haven't done out the FY 2023 data. We have it on the individual district data, which we're going to look at in just a minute. But some of that growth was driven somewhat by the ESSER dollars, which were the federal pandemic related dollars that school districts all across the state got. And some of those were used to supplant existing expenditures, but also some of those dollars, those ESSER dollars, were used to fund new initiatives and new staff. So when you see this go up, just be aware you're looking in the rearview mirror. We're not looking forward. Okay. So, while this trend has been very positive, one of the things that we're going to see is with the expiration of the federal money, which is coming out of all Iowa districts, this is going to put a lot of pressure on the spending authority going forward. Because one thing that we're concerned about, frankly, at the state level is not just the individual district situations, but obviously what the state is going to provide for the state supplementary assistance rate. And I know that there's always seems to be a lot of discussion at the state level about what the SSA rate is going to be. And I know sometimes it seems like, gee, they always talk about these numbers like 2% or 3%. Doesn't make a lot of difference. And I'll show you here in just a couple of minutes. It does have a significant impact on what school districts are going to see for new resources. So once again, this is kind of a looking backwards, or at least looking currently, but at least it gives you a sense of where your district is currently. And I'll stop that share for just a second and I'll start a new one. So to pull out and look forward into the future is one of the great challenges as far as when we talk about financial planning that school districts have. Not because of the calculations themselves are complex for school districts, and I'll just give you a sense of what is happening every year for a school district. But it's not just that, but it's really having to look into the crystal ball and make some estimates around some assumptions on key input variables that are going to affect a school district's budget. And we talked about a couple of them already. One is the SSA rate. Number two is a school district's enrollment. And, enrollment, as I mentioned, is a key driver in the formula. Every student that you gain in the current fiscal year brings with them about $7,635. And every district that leaves the district takes with them about $7,600. So enrollment has a huge impact. The amount per pupil also has a huge impact, and trying to estimate those on a going forward basis is a challenging activity. But we also have to go through basically 5 years of what we call the certified budget process. And that really is going through the entire projection of what your budget would be for a year, and then doing that over and over and over, basically 5 consecutive times, so that we can give you a 5-year projection of where your school district is going to be at. And so what you see on the screen right now is just one of the interest screens that we use in this 5-year projection. Try not to get too far into the weeds on this one, but I think it's really key when we look at understanding where the school district is potentially headed, is to pay attention. And I'm just going to scroll over just a little bit here so you can hopefully see it real clearly. Up here in the top of the page, on every screen that we go through, we're going to have three key trends. We're going to have the unspent authorized budget. We're going to have the district's property tax rate, and we're going to have what we call the UAB, which is his unspent authorized budget or unused credit card limit, as a percentage of your current year authority. It's just a percentage measure of what the surplus is. And
Gary,
so, go ahead.
is there any way that you could zoom in just a little bit?
What we're trying to do is to pay attention to this very top line, this unspent authorized budget, because that's the key one that we're keeping a track on. And I just want to show you, just because it's real easy on this page to see what we've got down here is the state supplementary assistance rate. And I'm going to note, and you're going to notice there are going to be a bunch of negative numbers here off to the right. Don't pay attention to those yet, because I've got some other things to show you, but I just want to show you the relationship between the different levels of SSA. And if you just keep your eye on that top right number, which happens to be at this point negative 6 million, and I'm just going to change all these from 1% to 3%. And you can see that that number's changed by an order of $5 million. So the amount that the SSA rate grows by controls how much that credit card limit grows by. So when we say a 3% growth in SSA, what we're saying is that credit card limit per student grows by 3% during the year. So as I said, enrollment has an impact, the SSA rate has an impact, but since we need to do a projection of what the school district is going to be facing, we need to pick what we think is going to be at least a reasonable starting point for an estimate. And what I'm going to use right now for just a starting point for the estimate was just 2.5%. I hope it's going to be that high. It could be lower than that. And I'm going to show you what this means ultimately for the school district. We also have the ability in this model to forecast and change enrollment. And so we can look at different enrollment scenarios. And I've got a summary table here at the end that I'm going to show you, but just to illustrate that the model has the ability to go through and project all of these things as we go through the projection. It takes into account all aspects of your spending, whether that is your special ed spending, dropout prevention, supplementary weighting, your instructional support program, and any modified supplemental amount, miscellaneous income, and ultimately we're focusing now on general fund expenditures. And so I did, before we got on, I logged on tonight, I did just a couple of scenarios just so hopefully that you can see some of the relatedness of this. Right now, what we've got in the scenario is a 2.5% gross expenditure growth. And we have to assume that expenditures are going to grow by something during the year because of expenditures for salaries and benefits and keeping the lights on and all the costs that are associated with inflationary increases. And then what we've done is, working with Evan and Stephanie, we've come up with some expenditure year-to-date expenditure adjustments due to the expiration of the federal money. And one of the things that we've seen this year is a reduction in the federal money, because school districts used up the vast majority of their federal money in FY23. And that some of those expenditures were not recurring, but some of them were. And one challenge that the district is facing right now is the district's spending authority from FY22 to FY23, FY23 to FY24 is projected to decline by about $600,000. And after you can see that this decline up here in the unspent authorized budget, assuming that can't continue, we have to put in an assumed expenditure adjustment to say, what would it take for you to stabilize your spending authority? And so I'm just going to go over here and just show you just a couple of scenarios that I did, just to show you the relationship between both expenditure growth and enrollment. Now, in these two scenarios, I assumed stable enrollment, 1% SSA, and you'll see there's commonality between these two. 1% SSA, 2.5% overall expenditure growth, and then solved for what overall expenditure of ongoing expenditure reduction was needed to get your unspent in line with about 20% at the end of 5 years, so that it didn't crater, go negative, and cause problems. And with 1% SSA, that needed a $1.8 million reduction. With 2% SSA, it was a $1.2 million reduction. And with 3% SSA, it was an $800,000 reduction. If we assumed that expenditures grew by a 0.5% rate greater than that, that same reduction goes from 1.8 million to 2.2 million, from 1.2 million to 1.6 million, and from 800,000 to 1.2 million, simply because of the expenditure growth that you have to make the reduction to get to ultimately solve the expenditure issue. So that just hopefully gives you a kind of a feeling for, there's really small percentage changes in both inputs like our SSA rate and our expenditures as school districts have a huge impact ultimately on what it takes us to get back to keep our spending authority where we need it to be. Another scenario I did just to show you the how much enrollment means to a school district. I did the same 1%, 2%, and 3% SSA, and then just assume the 2.5% expenditure base growth. So you'll see this is the same scenario as up above with a $1.2 million reduction. And that was assuming stable and basically stable enrollment. If we just assumed a loss of 10 students a year each year over the next 5 years, so a loss in basically of net 50 students, that $1.2 million reduction becomes a loss. It becomes a reduction of $1.5 million. So these all have really related, I guess, is the way to think about it. And so what in producing what we think is maybe the best estimate of where your finances are heading right now, I'm going to tell you that this scenario with assuming a 2.5% base expenditure increase, 2% SSA, which I think is, I wish it would be higher than 2%. I wish the legislature would set higher than 2% SSA, but at this point, I feel I feel that that's a reasonable but conservative estimate of where the legislature is going to end up. That ultimately, to stem the reduction in the spending authority that Fairfield is experiencing, is going to take a reduction of approximately about $1.2 million in ongoing expenditures. Now, it doesn't have to be all in 1 year, but it's got to be to the point that you arrest the reduction of the unspent authorized budget and keep that from going negative, because that's the one that triggers the pretty severe consequences. And so, for example, if I put just an, we can put it anywhere, but if I put a $1.2 million reduction in here, you're going to see that the unspent basically recovers to about and holds steady at about 20%, a little less than 20%, still declining a little bit. But that's really, now, every expenditure scenario, we can do any expenditure scenarios that folks want. But really, when we think about it, those are the key ones that we look at, because the district has done really everything that they can do as far as leveraging resources. So there's not a lot, the district already has the full amount of the instructional support levy. The district already has the full dropout prevention. There's no real resource where the district can go out and say, hey, we'd like to go get more money. You can't, there's no mechanism to go to the patrons of the Fairfield district, say, hey, we'd like our general fund to be larger. There's just no way to do that. So really, when we have resource restrictions like that, ultimately, to get things in line from a spending authority perspective, ultimately you have to do that on the expenditure side of the equation, unfortunately. Now, if the legislature set 5% SSA, a lot of this discussion would be different. But given where the history's been over the last decade is just under 2%, having a 2% SSA rate is, I think, is relatively prudent. So I realize that is a lot of information in a very, very short period of time. I'd love to see if there were questions that I could certainly answer. I'm going to go off the screen share here just so that you're not looking at just a spreadsheet. So I'm going to take a breath for a second, and then let's see what questions there are that I can answer for people.
I'm just wondering if you could model it briefly with increased enrollment over 5 years, maybe slightly increased over 5 people.
And I'm getting just a little bit of feedback, but I thought I heard somebody say, could I model it with an increased enrollment?
Correct, yes.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's, yeah, very easy to do. Very easy to do. Sure. We can come in. And we can do, we can add 10 kids a year just as a, just to see what impact it has. Come back over to the expenses side. And then you can see that the unspent starts to actually go up. And so that means that the reduction that we're going to have to, that you'd have to make, comes down to be less. So down in the neighborhood of, let's say, an $800,000 reduction. It's not exactly stable, but really, really, really close to stable. So yeah, the model, that's a really nice thing about having the projection model, is the ability to do these kind of on the fly scenarios. The only thing I would say to you is, anytime that you put an assumption in, we can model any assumption you want into these, is, just making sure that they're based in reality. As my boss used to say, I used to have a boss who had loved to have a saying, hope is not a strategy. So, but yeah, and those assumptions that we put in, and the real wild cards, that SSA rate is one of them, and enrollment's the other one too. Yeah, absolutely. Other questions?
Hey Larry, I noticed in your projections that in FY25 that the levy goes up to $12 in some sense. I was just wondering, is that an automatic raise, or what's going into that raise right there?
No, that's a great point. And thanks for pointing that out. One of the things that you're going to notice, and I'll zoom up here, is you're going to notice that the district solvency ratio starts to decline, and that's that fourth entry down here, and it goes from 10.5% down to 2.1%. And let me bring that up just a second. There we go. So as you look at it, the solvency ratio drops from 10.5% in FY23, which is an actual, down to an estimate of 2.1%. A couple of things have happens here. Number one is, when a school district's in Iowa, no school district, once there's effectively your solvency ratio reaches 20%, they can't levy any cash reserve any longer. And so Fairfield had been above 20% for a number of years. And so, but what happens is when the solvency ratio starts to fall, which is just a measure of cash, when that starts to fall, the only way to make that recover, there's really two ways. One is to cut expenditures, can do that. But really the second way, and the way that you really have to do it, is by start levying some cash reserve. And so what you're seeing is the district starting to levy, and we modeled in here just the levying of cash reserve to help recover the solvency ratio. And that's a total of about 2.4 million each year. which brings up about just a little share higher than about $2 a thousand. Starts out at, hold on, let me look at it's about 250 a thousand for a few years to get that solvency ratio back up. Now, it doesn't mean it has to be exactly like that. It could, you could move those around some, but if we looked at the history on the property tax rate, you can see that at one point it was well over $14 a thousand. Fell, I know, because there was, I think, bond was paid off, but some of it also was because the district just can't levy any cash reserve and is going to have to start levying some cash reserve into the future. Good question.
I got another one. So on that graph where we're showing the per pupil UAV, there's like a ski slope that's going straight up, or it looks like we're not spending $4,000 per student that we could have. What caused that to go up so fast, and what do we think is going to cause it to come down so fast?
Yeah, it's a great point. It's a great question. Part of what caused it to go, and there's really two things. Number one was the federal money. Some of that money was used to supplant existing expenditures or replace existing expenditures. So that federal money replaced existing general fund expenditures. So you didn't spend the money. So that caused that unspent to go up as part of that. Part of it also was just an underspending in any given year. And it's not just, and I will say it's not just Fairfield. I've got a lot of districts that went through this exact same thing because there was a lot of uncertainty during those years as well. And uncertainty breeds a conservatism of expenditures just because you're not sure what's going to happen over the next couple of years. So lots of things happen, but primarily it looks to me like a lot of it was the federal money caused that to grow. What's going to cause it to decline is the expiration of those, because some of that federal money was used to pay for ongoing expenditures that the revenue is no longer going to be there for.
Larry, can you go back to the projection?
Yeah.
Now, Larry, if SSA rates remain steady and we don't have an increase in enrollment, what needs to be cut next year in order to get this control?
Yeah, I mean, assuming what we think for SSA, and we know your enrollment already for next year because that's already set because that was October 1 enrollment. I mean, I believe that the targeted number needs to be about in that $1.2 million range. I think that that's a number that represents an amount that will at least get you in the ballpark of and give the district some flexibility also going into the future, depending what happens with the legislature. I mean, there's lots of concern about what's going to happen with things like the income tax and that stuff going forward. So, yeah, right now, I mean, could be as little as 800,000, could be as bad as 1.8 million. Seems like the prudent middle estimate is about $1.2 million.
Do you think that only needs to be cut in one school year?
I don't know if it has to be cut all in one year, but it's the sooner, I mean, one thing I'll tell you is just budget problems are not like a fine wine. They don't get better with time. The dollar that you don't cut this year becomes two that you got to cut next year. So, does it have to be all done in 1 year? No, it doesn't have to all be done in 1 year, but got to make a significant inroad into it because, and one of the things I really do want to caution you about is, um, uh, you know, you got to be careful about what you add back into the budget. Um, you know, when somebody tells me that, they cut 500,000 out of the budget, and then salary increases and benefit increases and miscellaneous stuff went up by 400,000. Well, then you didn't cut that out of the budget. You really cut you know a lesser amount. So um, requiring some it's going to require, I realize, some discipline over a couple of years to get where you need to be, but over the long run it'll serve the district well going forward.
Given that about 80% of our budget, our general fund budget, is on benefits and salary, is there anything in that number that tells you about our staffing levels compared to other schools?
Unfortunately, I don't get the granularity of detail on the expenditure side. What I would tell you, though, is that, when I look at the overall general fund expenditures, they're about $3 million higher over a 3-year period. And to your point, you're exactly right. I mean, if 80% is salary and benefits, which is an average number, by the way, for school districts, 75 to 80% is pretty average for school districts all over the state. If spending is up by that amount, most likely 75 or 80% of that number is where that's coming from. So yeah, I hear your point, and yeah, it's at this end of the day, to achieve a reduction like that, is going to require, some reduction in overall levels of staffing.
Larry, this is Dave Spur, new school board member. I have a question on open enrollment or enrollment and its effect. So on the downside, it looks like as little as 2 students. Why does it have such a compounding effect? Why is that?
I'm sorry, I lost the last, and it's just my headphones were
Why does
reverberating.
enrollment have such a compounding effect, particularly on
Oh, yeah. Why does it have such a compounding effect? That's a great question. It's so outsized because the per pupil value is so significant at $7,600 per kid. Um, one kid difference can wipe out a quarter of a percentage point of SSA, for example, or 10 kids can wipe out a quarter percentage point SSA. So yeah, enrollment does have an outsized impact without a doubt, just because of the high value associated with it. And open enrollment just it just adds to that, right? Because it's just another child lost or gained, whichever way it goes.
Is there any role that budget guarantee comes into this model?
We calculate your budget guarantee in here. It didn't it didn't come into impact the projection we were doing, because even with a 10 kid enrollment decline, that's not enough to trigger the budget guarantee. The budget guarantee guarantees you 1% growth in your regular program budget. And so what it like if you have a 3% decline in your enrollment and 1% increase in the per pupil, well, that's a negative 2%. So they get you to 1%. None of the scenarios that we did were severe enough to trigger it, but the model does take that into account. Absolutely.
Larry, can you just state for all of us what our certified enrollment number was for 2023?
Yeah. So for 2023, the certified enrollment, this was the 10-1 of 21. So FY23 was 1607. FY24, which was the 10-1 to 22, was 1568. And for the most recent October, it was 1525.
Just so I heard that right, so it went from about 1600 to 1525 in 3 years.
Yep, that's correct.
I'm also just curious, how does that compare to other districts that you've worked with? Are you seeing a trend like that, in other districts as well? Or are we an anomaly?
The enrollment decline has been impacting districts all over the state. And we've got a new aspect to it here that we've not had before, which was obviously the educational savings accounts starting to siphon away. It's not had a huge impact yet on school districts just because it was only applied to kindergartners and students who met certain eligibility requirements. But it is going to start to have more of an impact. About 150 to 175 districts have seen moderate to significant enrollment declines over the last decade. And so now do we find some districts that kind of buck the trend or seeing enrollment increases? Yeah, we do. But that is relatively uncommon. Really, most of the enrollment growth around the state is concentrated in about 25 roughly school districts. There are about, as I said, 150 to 175 who are losing enrollment, and the remainder are just treading water. So no, I'm not unique in any way. And I will also say that the other thing that's really thrown things just kind of for school districts has been coming out of the pandemic. Enrollment has become, frankly, just really flaky. And it's just something that we've noticed that kids seem to come or sometimes seem to disappear without much reason or cause. So.
Now, Larry, obviously in general, we're all on the same point, but so obviously the recent last several years of finance have been in such a shape or a period of finance industry. It's hard to really get all the answers from all the other local businesses at the same time. So I mean, are you having these type of meetings, districts of our state or districts of our size all over the state, and are they all formulating similar plan of taxes that we are addressing it, or where are you?
And I might need somebody to repeat that if that was a question, because I just couldn't make it out. I'm sorry.
So, I mean, what are other districts doing to address the same issues that we're dealing with right now?
Okay. So what are other districts doing? Yeah, no, it's a great question. I will tell you that school districts are looking at every opportunity to save general fund money that they can. Now, I will be honest with you that, most of the easy money was gone years ago. And I think one thing that has been especially challenging over the last couple of years, obviously, has been staffing. Because, obviously, we can't get away with a 1 or a 2% settlement and hope to have staff. But school districts are looking at every opportunity they can, and looking really hard at any spending that kind of crept in during the pandemic, and making sure that that spending is sustainable. So, school districts look at every opportunity they can to save money, but one of the ways that school districts do that, historically has been through looking at things like early retirement programs, but that's been kind of a double-edged sword here over the last couple of years because retiring people, retiring your most senior staff, it's been very hard to find replacements for people. So, some of the traditional ways that we've used to manage the budget haven't been as prevalent over the last couple of years.
In your experience, can you elaborate on how a district in our position might still consider new facilities?
Might still consider, I'm sorry, the last part, I just missed that last.
New facilities and
Oh,
how,
yeah, considering new facilities at a time when you're looking at this. I mean, school districts look at facilities for because they do also have an operational impact as well. School districts take electricity, school districts take all the operational costs that are associated. So, constantly looking at facilities and seeing if those can be used, to make the district run more efficiently within the general fund. So school districts, and also just the reality that even during this time, even when school districts might be experiencing a decline in enrollment, the physical infrastructure, the needs of that never seem to end. And it just seems like it's a perpetual process of replacing decaying infrastructure. So, yeah, it's a challenge, and I know it's a challenge. When you're talking to people in a community about it as well, because people say, well, hey, your enrollment's declining. Why do you need to look at new facilities? Well, the old facilities, maybe aren't as efficient and are actually costing us more money in the long run. So.
So we're looking at our PEPAL, going for that vote in the next 2 years. And we've been talking about possibly increasing that because we currently are spending some money out of our general fund that could be moved into PEPAL funds, and so free up a little bit of general. At 33 cents voted PEPAL, are we on the low side here?
Yeah, you've got the 33-cent board approved. Yeah, you've got the 67-cent voted, which could go as high as $1.34. So you're halfway. So there is significant room in your voted Pebble to add more resource. And because Pebble voted Pebble resources, there is some crossover between things that you can spend for your general fund and things that you can spend out of Pebble, that by raising that would free up and give you a little more room within your general fund. I understand that completely. About about half of the districts in the state are at the full $1.34 per thousand. And the remainder are somewhere, less than that currently. So yeah, it would absolutely give you more infrastructure dollars to spend for, things that could be occupying in your general fund now.
So also our tax levy over less than 10 years has dropped from $15 to about $10. How abnormal is that for a district to be having their levy go down that fast?
It's if you'd asked me 10 years ago, I would have said it would be extremely unusual. It's not as unusual over the last decade for a couple of reasons just have been going on. Number one is, school districts have paid off bond issues. And if they paid off a debt service issue and didn't start a new one, that can cause their tax rate. But what kind of happened is a couple of things happened all at the same time with the district with Fairfield. Was not only did that the levy expire, but also you didn't need to levy any cash reserve at the same time, and so those two things together really caused the levy rate to fall. And then the legislature, in their infinite wisdom, also put a little more money into property tax relief at the same time. So those three things together caused the levy rate to fall. So yeah, I wouldn't say it's unusual, but I would say it's a bigger reduction than average. The average reduction over the last decade in property tax rates for school district has been about $1.75 per thousand. So certainly higher than the average, that's for sure.
Larry, is there a way to model how that increasing that Pebble rate would affect our budget?
Yes, it can be done. what I would say would be the real question is really just a question of, what would you be moving out of your general fund over to the Pebble if it was expanded to $1.34, and then that's a relatively easy ability to put that into the model. And just whatever that number is, and I could certainly work with Evan and Stephanie on that.
Do you happen to know what the success rate for Pepple raises was in the last election?
I don't know, other than just kind of my glancing at the statewide returns. And a couple went down in flames. We did have a couple that passed. So November was tough because we also had not only all the normal the Pebble elections, but there also were a lot of bond issues that were occurred during November, because those can only be voted in November now, and a lot of district had to hurry up to meet the timeline for this one. So. Any other questions?
We can try to sort through some of them. We haven't looked at them yet. Larry, that was about the box questions. We just haven't taken a read at them.
Oh, I'm sorry. I could not hear what the question was.
Oh, I'm just responding to the audience.
Oh, okay.
We haven't got a chance to look at the box questions yet.
Okay, sorry.
Larry, I think you touched on this a little bit, but let's just say that we do nothing to address it for the next 4 years. How specifically would that work out for the district for the next 4 years if we did absolutely?
And once again, I apologize. The audio was a little hard at the end, but what happens if you don't do anything?
Yeah, what happens if we do nothing to address it in the next 4 years?
Yeah, very, very clearly if you do nothing and the spending authority goes negative, the district will be required to appear in front of the School Budget Review Committee, the SBRC, and provide a workout plan associated with how you're going to right the ship. And if the district is negative a second consecutive year, also be required to do a workout plan as well. But in both of those cases, it engenders some pretty potentially severe consequences. If a district is not positive by year 3, they can be subject to being closed. It's just an unpleasant process because it doesn't just bring just a financial review of the school district, which it does. But that's not the only thing it does. It also triggers a full accreditation review as well during the process. And so really significant penalties can be associated with that, up to and including closing the district. So yeah, nothing to mess around with. So obviously much preferred that the district deals with the situation before it becomes negative. Because once it goes negative, then your hands become somewhat tied as far as what you can do as a response.
Now, I know that you painted the picture of, let's say we saw a small increase of, say, 10 students a year, for instance. Unfortunately, in our district, we have seen quite a few people open enrollment out. Let's say that we did some things to really aggressively change the tide of that ship and saw a large increase come back in the next several years, let's say 60, 70, 80 kids, whatever it may be. How would that change the picture for us? I know that's a big idea there, but we've seen a lot of people leave. reviewing things to try to work.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I mean, I applaud any effort that you can do to change that trend in open enrollment. I'd caution you as using that as the sole strategy to correct the spending, because if you get to the end of 3 or 4 years and it hasn't done it, then you're going to be looking at reductions that are going to be much more significant. That $1.2 million at the end of 5 years is going to be more like, 1.6, $1.7 million at the end of 5 years. What I would recommend would be looking significantly at your expenditures, what reductions have to be made, and then if open enrollment, if you're able to turn that tide in open enrollment, be very easy to start adding back program and expenditure. But the one thing that will get districts in trouble is, as I said earlier, is preparing for a strategy. A hope as a strategy is not effective. So I really encourage you to think about what expenditure reductions need to be made, and then if that enrollment trend starts to turn around, then adding back staff or adding back program as you see those students start to return. That's entirely appropriate.
Larry, can you explain how property taxes are in how that works in the model? Is there an assumption that property taxes stay the same, go up, go down, and how does that impact the model?
Yeah, absolutely. When we do in the model, what we do as far as projections around property tax rates is we project each of the individual levies themselves, and then sum those up. Our assumption is for your rate-based levies, like your voted Pebble, that those are going to stay constant throughout the life of the projection. Your 33 cents going to stay at 33 cents, those kind of things. For those levies that are driven in the general fund by the formula, we let the formula work as to project the property tax rate as the actual formula would as you were doing the certified budget. So it really does mimic exactly that process. So you may see because of an action that the district takes, the property tax rate may go up a little bit. In this case, you saw that we had loaded in about 2.4 million a year in cash reserve levy. That was obviously was just something that as Ev and I are working together, we put in the model just to see what it would take to stem the solvency ratio declining. So some of these things are driven by the formula. Some of them are programmed in as flat, and then some are adjusted, based upon what we're trying to model in property taxes themselves.
So you said that if we go negative in our UAB, we get put on a program, could possibly be closed. Do you know how many schools historically do that per year and get put on programs? And I have heard some people kind of projecting that we could have, a dozen schools closed in the next few years because of the end of ESSER money. What kind of prospects do you think going forward are other districts, having struggles?
Yeah, in a normal average year, I'm hard to say any year is normal, but in an average year over the last 25 years I've been doing this, it wasn't uncommon years ago to see 5, 6, 7 districts. Anymore, like this SBRC, for example, is just going to meet next week. I know there happen to be 3 districts this year that are negative on their unspent authorized budget this year. So in any given year, usually 3 to 5 maybe would be a kind of a typical number. Some of those maybe just, heading in, and then some, like Davenport, if you probably followed the travails at Davenport. Davenport was another school that went negative, but they were negative for almost 5 years. So sometimes coming out of it can take a little bit longer than that. But as far as the number of schools that we could see because of the expiration of the federal money, I don't know the number, But I'm going to tell you, after doing, we had about 190 districts come to my 5-year projection workshops in the end of October. There are some districts that are like yours, facing down some significant budgetary reductions due to the expiration of the federal money. And so I think that's going to be the thing that's really going to hit school districts over the next couple of years. They're really starting to see the impact of, the federal money going away. And it was great while it lasted, and it was an influx of federal money. Like I said, I've been doing this the school side of things almost 25 years. I had never seen anything close to it. But it is going to create some problems as the tide pulls out.
I wanted to see if there are any more questions from board members. We have had a chance to go through the questions that are in the box, and several of those questions are related to specific aspects of our budgets, things that we've spent money on, and that's not really, Larry doesn't have that working knowledge of what we've budgeted for and where we've allocated money, other than what's available to him and what we put into the projection model. So we wanted to gather those questions that would help inform our communication back out. We do intend to have lots of opportunity for community, staff, parents to continue to ask those questions so that we can communicate that back out in a transparent, consistent way. So I would just open up again to any board members that might want any closing questions for Larry, and then we'll thank him for his time.
Larry, our real estate market here has been kind of crazy. Our values have spiked over the last few years, and we saw a really significant increase in our assessed values. So I'm curious how that's going to affect our, income from property taxes, given that, those tax rates went up so significantly.
Yeah, you and a bunch of other people saw a big increase in their property tax assessments. Especially residential. We here in the metro, we saw residential go up 18 to 22%. So yeah, it happened a lot of other places. So what you're going to see what happened this fall, that the Department of Revenue just released the rollback figures, and you got to remember the assessed value is not what you pay tax on; it's the taxable value, and the difference between those assessed and taxable is you take your assessed value, you multiply it times the rollback. Well, the rollback for residential, it went from 54 down to 46%. So what you're going to see is, even though that 15, 18, 19, 20% increase in assessed value, ultimately, after you take into account the impact of the rollback, is going to be somewhere between 2 to 4% net increase in property taxes. So that rollback change is going to blunt a lot of that assessment increase that we saw. Now, also likewise, the rollback on ag land also declined dramatically, I think from 91 to 70%, which will also blunt some of the impact that ag land saw, because ag land went up as well. And that decline in that rollback will also help offset some of that increase. So the short answer is yeah, we saw a big increase in assessments. We'll see a lower percentage increase when it actually comes to the taxes that are paid on that. But that's a great question. Yeah, absolutely. I know it's on everybody's mind.
One question here is, with the ESSER funds that are expiring in every district, I think it's going to come across as you kind of explain that. Are there any strategies that people are doing to try and use those in a way to reduce the general fund expenditures in the years coming up?
Yeah, school districts, I mean, and school districts were good about that. Was because in this money that was the ESSER money, the federal money that was due to the pandemic, there was a provision in that the federal money which said that you could what we call supplant. All it means is replace. That's just a fancy term for replace. It meant that you could replace other money that you were already spending for that purpose. And so school districts did that. They replaced a lot of existing expenditures, which is, as I mentioned earlier, is one of the reasons in your district why we saw the unspent authorized budget increase was because you replaced, and supplanted some of those existing expenditures. And so that was kind of the strategy on the way up was to bank some of that effectively money as spending authority in your unspent authorized budget. And then when the federal money went away, is we would use it and to try and transition out. We're unfortunately in that transition out period right now, and having to ultimately reduce the spending. So yeah, school districts did what, and if we had more federal money, and the federal money continued, we continue that strategy. The problem is it's just most school districts, if they aren't already out of their federal money last fiscal year, are burning the remainder of it up this year because it's got to be burned up this year.
A couple of examples of how Fairfield Schools has done that. We have used ESSER money to use or to purchase Leader in Me services and curriculum for a 5-year span. We also use that to purchase math workbooks, K-8 for 3 years. So just a couple of examples of what you were just talking about that's specific to Fairfield.
So Larry, I was going through the box here, just looking through a few questions that some people in the crowd had. These are kind of some basic, school finance questions that people are just kind of curious about. So the first one I'm going to ask is, can you apply for variances to move money around from accounts? Can you kind of explain that to the crowd and they can all understand how that works?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I wish there was more flexibility than there is. Unfortunately, there is limited flexibility. Now we do have a little bit of flexibility, and I'm going to call within the general fund. Some of those categoricals we now have some more flexibility than we've had in prior years through what we call the flexibility account or the flexibility fund, of moving some of those down. But those were all still within the general fund. The ability to move funds truly between funds, like between sales tax and the general fund, is limited only to when you have allowable expenditures in both. You can pick which fund you want to pay for it out of, and you'd obviously pick the non-general fund one, which is the most preferable one. So you use those dollars to help offset that general fund impact. But as far as a waiver process or anything like that to say, hey, we'd like an exemption to use all of our Pebble and our other sales tax dollars in our general fund, no, there's no mechanism to do that. That would take a law change.
Another question I have, can we save COVID money to affect things moving forward, like COVID money offset expenses in the future? You hear me?
If the question is, could we bank that money for the future? The answer is unfortunately no. We're kind of in a use it or lose it situation now. We've got to use up the remainder of the federal money by the end of this fiscal year. And otherwise they just take it back. So we can't really bank it for any longer than what we've got it for right now. Did that answer that question?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
We run a sizable special ed deficit, probably a lot like most schools. Am I correct in my understanding that that does not affect our UOB whatsoever because we pretty much get spending authority dollar for dollar for whatever we go for a deficit?
Yeah, it's probably the only time you're going to hear a finance geek like me say the word deficit is not a bad thing, right? What the special ed deficit is just says we get so many dollars generated for our special ed students. And if the actual cost that we have to serve those students is higher than what those revenues that are generated by the state, that's what we're talking about there. That creates that deficit. And we get that spending authority back from the state to make us whole for that. So in short, special ed expenditures don't impact your unspent authorized budget because you get the spending authority for it if you spend more. If you spend less, well, you never spend it in the first place, so there's no expenditure. So yeah, there's no there that the special ed deficit itself has no impact on your unspent authorized budget because of that feature of the formula.
All right, any other questions by the board? All right. Larry, I'd like to thank you for stopping by. It's always good to have a numbers geek, stat nerd, whatever you want to call yourself, look over our numbers, give us a real clear picture. I think you've helped that. We have a lot of brand new board members that just got elected in, and this is the kind of thing that I wish I had when I first started too. This is a great crash course in looking at our finances.
Well, and I want to thank you very much for letting me appear electronically. I always like to say I really appreciate it because, there are no deer on the information superhighway. So I really appreciate that. So, and thank you for being customers of ISFIS. If there's anything that we can do, we have a lot of resources, especially for new board members, a lot of resources for explaining school finance and also a resource as well. And as Stephanie and Evan will tell you too, we're literally just a phone call away. So should you need anything at all that's school finance or legislative related, please don't hesitate to reach out and let us know. So thanks a lot, everybody.
Thank you very much, Larry.
Bye-bye.